No one inside the Cleveland Browns expected the season to tilt this way. Not the front office, not the fans, and definitely not the players who were supposed to be at the center of everything. When the year started, the story was already written in most people's minds. Big money at wide receiver, a young quarterback learning on the fly, a roster built to showcase names, speed, and upside. But as the weeks dragged on and the margins got tighter, something uncomfortable started to surface. The Browns' offense wasn't leaning on its stars, it was surviving through something far less glamorous. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because the most reliable weapon down the stretch didn't come with marketing hype or a polished reputation. It wasn't the receiver with the $40 million deal. It wasn't the player penciled in as WR1 on every depth chart graphic. It was a rookie tight end, quiet, unassuming, and overlooked, who kept showing up when the offense had no room for mistakes. No grand gestures, no sideline posturing, just catches, chain-moving plays, and touchdowns that mattered. While others drifted in and out of relevance, this rookie became the safety valve, the constant, the one option the quarterback trusted when the chaos peaked. That trust is where this story really begins, because quarterbacks don't choose targets based on contracts or reputation once the pocket collapses. They choose based on survival. And late in games, with pressure screaming off the edge and protection breaking down, Shedeur Sanders wasn't scanning the field for whoever was paid the most. He was looking for whoever would be exactly where they were supposed to be. That shift didn't happen overnight. It happened snap by snap, mistake by mistake, until the hierarchy everyone assumed was locked in quietly fell apart. What made it jarring wasn't just the numbers, although those alone raised eyebrows. It was the contrast. On one side, consistency without headlines. On the other, expectation without payoff. Jeudy was brought to Cleveland to be the answer, the dependable WR1 who could stabilize a young quarterback and justify every dollar of his deal. Instead, as the season wore on, his presence felt less central and more optional. Routes missed, timing off, moments that demanded authority met with hesitation. And while that tension simmered beneath the surface, the offense kept moving away from him without ever announcing the decision out loud. That's what made this moment so unexpected. There was no formal demotion, no press release, no dramatic declaration from the coaching staff. The Browns didn't wake up one morning and decide to abandon their original plan. Reality did it for them. Games got tighter, windows got smaller, and in those moments, reliability beat reputation every single time. The rookie tight end didn't just outperform expectations, he exposed a flaw in how this offense had been built and how this roster had been valued. And once that crack appeared, it spread fast. Because when a young quarterback starts leaning on the cheapest, quietest option on the field instead of the highest paid receiver, it signals something deeper than a hot streak or a schematic quirk. It signals a breakdown in trust. It forces uncomfortable questions about evaluation, accountability, and whether the organization has been rewarding the right traits all along. The Browns didn't plan for this storyline, but by the end of the season, they couldn't escape it either. That's why this isn't just about one surprising breakout or one disappointing contract. This is about the moment the Browns were forced to confront a truth they'd been dodging for years. The moment reliability became more valuable than upside. The moment survival football replaced highlight football. And the moment the entire direction of the franchise quietly shifted before anyone even realized it was happening. He didn't announce himself. There was no viral clip, no chest-thumping celebration, no sudden push from the league to crown a new star. He just kept showing up. Snap after snap, week after week, the rookie tight end became the most dependable presence in an offense that couldn't afford mistakes. When timing routes broke down and protection collapsed, he didn't freelance or disappear. He settled into space, finished plays, and moved the chains. In an environment defined by volatility, he became the calm center that everything else orbited around. What made his rise impossible to ignore wasn't flash, it was function. 72 catches, 600+ yards, 6 touchdowns. Those numbers didn't come from manufactured touches or broken coverages. They came from trust. third and medium, red zone windows, late game situations where a drop changes the outcome. That's where he lived. And while the rest of the offense rotated through inconsistency, he became the one constant the coaching staff could lean on without second guessing. For a rookie, that kind of responsibility usually comes with mistakes, but his game never felt rushed. His routes were clean, his hands were steady, he knew where to be before the ball was even snapped. That awareness mattered more than raw athleticism, especially for a young quarterback learning under pressure. When everything else on the field felt uncertain, this tight end made decisions easier. And in the NFL, that's how trust compounds fast. By mid-season, the shift was already happening, even if nobody said it out loud. Targets were gravitating his way in high-leverage moments. Play designs subtly began to feature him as the first read rather than the safety option. And when games tightened, he wasn't being used as a decoy or outlet. He was the plan. Not because of a depth chart change, but because results demanded it. The most telling part wasn't just that he led the team in production, it was who he finished ahead of. A rookie tight end quietly outpacing a supposed WR1 in nearly every meaningful category doesn't happen by accident. It happens when reliability wins internal battles that contracts can't protect. Every catch he made raised the same unspoken question. If this player can deliver consistently with less experience, less investment, and less margin for error, why can't the ones paid to lead do the same? That contrast reshaped how the offense functioned. Quarterbacks don't wait for validation from the front office when the pocket's collapsing. They throw to certainty, and more often than not, that certainty came from an unexpected place. The rookie didn't just earn targets, he earned credibility. And once that happened, the entire structure of the offense began to tilt around him, whether the organization was ready to admit it or not. And that quiet takeover did something even more dangerous. It exposed everything that wasn't working. Every missed route, every stalled drive, every moment of visible frustration elsewhere suddenly felt louder by comparison. The rookie tight end didn't create the dysfunction, he illuminated it. And once that light was on, there was no way the Browns could pretend the rest of the offense was functioning the way it was supposed to. There's a moment in every season when labels stop carrying weight. Depth charts, contract numbers, preseason expectations, they all fade once the games start demanding real answers. For the Browns, that moment arrived quietly, buried inside broken protections and third down desperation. Because when WR1 status actually mattered, when the offense needed someone to assert control, the title didn't translate into impact. And once that disconnect surfaced, the label stopped meaning anything at all. Jeudy was supposed to bring clarity. That was the entire point of the investment. A proven route runner, a clean separator, a receiver paid and positioned to stabilize a young quarterback and serve as the focal point when things broke down. On paper, it made perfect sense. In reality, the offense kept moving without him. Not deliberately at first, but out of necessity. Routes didn't sync, timing felt late. Opportunities that demanded assertiveness turned into neutral plays instead of momentum swings. The problem wasn't just production, it was presence. True WR1s tilt coverage, they force defensive adjustments, they create answers even when plays collapse. But week after week, the Browns weren't building their critical moments around Jeudy, they were surviving past him. When pressure arrived early and reads had to be instant, the ball went elsewhere. And in the NFL, that's the most telling vote you can cast against a player's status. What made it awkward was that no one ever said the quiet part out loud. There wasn't a demotion or a press conference reframing expectations. The gap simply widened on its own. While the rookie tight end grew into the offense, Jeudy's role felt increasingly disconnected from the moments that decide games. His stat line became serviceable, but serviceable isn't what franchises pay WR1 money for. It's not what young quarterbacks lean on when the structure breaks. As the season wore on, that imbalance bled into body language. Missed connections lingered longer, frustration showed faster, and once tension replaces trust, even elite talent struggles to reassert itself. The offense didn't collapse because Jeudy was on the field, it just didn't stabilize when he was supposed to take over. And that's a far more dangerous realization for a front office. Because WR1 status isn't about where you line up or how much you're paid, it's about gravity. It's about being unavoidable in the moments defenses are daring you to deliver. And by the end of the season, Jeudy didn't feel unavoidable. He felt optional. That's when the label lost its power. And that's when the Browns were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. You can't scheme around expectations if the execution never catches up. It didn't happen in a vacuum. Moments like this never do. What exploded on the sideline was only visible because everything underneath it had already cracked. The tension had been building for weeks, maybe longer, simmering through missed reads, stalled drives, and an offense constantly fighting uphill. When the cameras finally caught it, it looked sudden. In reality, it was the release point. The exchange between Shedeur Sanders and Jeudy wasn't just a heated disagreement, it was a collision between expectation and reality. A young quarterback trying to hold a fractured offense together. A veteran receiver still operating as if the title on his resume outweighed what was happening between the lines. When words were exchanged, they carried more than frustration. They carried months of unresolved disconnect. What made that moment so significant wasn't the volume or the emotion, it was who it centered on. Franchises can absorb conflict when it revolves around secondary pieces. They can spin it as passion or competitiveness. But when your quarterback, the player everything else is being built around, reaches a breaking point publicly, that shifts the entire conversation. That's no longer noise, that's a signal. Up to that point, the Browns could point to context, injuries, protection issues, growing pains. All of it was valid, but the sideline clash stripped away the insulation. It showed a quarterback who no longer felt supported by the player paid to be his safety net, and it showed a receiver who, when challenged, didn't reassert trust through performance. That's where the moment crossed a line. It stopped being about emotions and started being about accountability. What followed was even more telling. There was no rush to downplay it, no aggressive narrative control, no quick pivot to the usual competitive fire explanations. The organization let the moment exist in public view, because deep down they knew it wasn't an anomaly. It was the physical manifestation of something they'd already been wrestling with internally. Trust had eroded, roles had blurred, and the offense had lost its connective tissue. In the NFL, sideline moments are rarely remembered for what was said, they're remembered for what they confirm. This one confirmed that WR1 status couldn't paper over inconsistency anymore. It confirmed that the quarterback was done pretending the structure around him was functional. And most importantly, it forced the Browns to stop separating production from leadership. Because once those two drift apart, no amount of talent can hold an offense together. That exchange didn't derail the season. The season had already been drifting. What it did was make the drift undeniable. From that point on, every decision the Browns faced would be shaped by a simple realization. Whatever they thought they were building wasn't actually holding up under pressure. And if they didn't address it at the root, moments like that wouldn't stop. They'd multiply. By the time the season reached its most unforgiving stretch, Shedeur Sanders wasn't being evaluated like most young quarterbacks. There was no clean pocket to study, no rhythm to dissect, no ideal conditions to project growth from. He was being evaluated in survival mode. Every snap felt like damage control. Every dropback came with an internal clock sped up by collapsing edges and leaky interiors. And yet, buried inside that chaos were signs the Browns couldn't ignore. The box score didn't flatter him. Over his final 7 starts, the numbers told a story critics were ready to latch onto. Interceptions outweighing touchdowns, drives stalling before they ever found momentum. On the surface, it looked like inconsistency, but context changed everything. Those turnovers didn't come from reckless confidence or lazy reads. They came when the pocket imploded before routes could even develop, when progressions turned into improvisation, when a young quarterback had to choose between forcing a throw or taking another hit. What stood out was how he responded to that pressure. Sanders didn't unravel. He didn't abandon the middle of the field or default to checkdowns out of fear. He stayed aggressive in spots where lesser quarterbacks would shut down. There were throws, tight window, off-platform, defenders draped over his arm that flashed real NFL-level poise. Not consistently, not cleanly, but enough to force the front office to ask a different question. Not, is he struggling, but what is he actually being asked to overcome? Because quarterback development doesn't happen in a vacuum. Mechanics suffer when footwork has no time to settle. Decision-making speeds up when protection never holds. Chemistry breaks down when receivers aren't where they're supposed to be. The Browns saw all of that unfold in real time. And instead of writing Sanders off for imperfect results, they started isolating the variables. What happens when the read is there, but the pocket collapses? What happens when the route wins, but the timing's off because the quarterback's already moving? That's where the evaluation shifted. Sanders wasn't failing assignments, he was surviving conditions that erased the margin for error. And despite that, he still put stretches on tape that hinted at something real. Calm under fire, willingness to stand in, an understanding of leverage that doesn't disappear.
Disappear just because the play breaks down. Those are traits you don't teach. You either see them or you don't. The Browns understood something else too. If they continued judging him by outcomes alone, they'd repeat the same mistake franchises make over and over, blaming the quarterback for the system collapsing around him. Instead, they reframed the entire assessment. Before they could decide if Sanders was the guy, they had to give him a real environment to operate in, one where protection isn't a gamble, one where timing routes actually have time to breathe, one where the quarterback isn't constantly forced into hero mode just to keep the offense upright. That realization changed everything. Sanders wasn't being graded on polish, he was being graded on resilience. And once the Browns saw that clearly, the conversation stopped being about replacing him and started being about protecting him. Because you can't judge a quarterback's ceiling when he's spending every snap just trying to stay on his feet. For a long time, the Browns tried to fix surface problems with headline solutions. Add a name here, patch a position there, hope talent alone would smooth over structural cracks. But when the season finally exposed how fragile that approach was, Andrew Berry stopped playing defense. What followed wasn't a tweak or a rebrand, it was a pivot. Quiet, deliberate, and far more radical than it looked from the outside. Berry's realization wasn't sparked by one bad game or one viral moment. It came from watching the same issues repeat regardless of who was on the field. Different quarterbacks, different receivers, same breakdowns. Pressure up the middle, missed assignments, an offense that never felt settled. At some point, the pattern became impossible to ignore. You can't evaluate skill players when the foundation beneath them keeps collapsing, and you definitely can't develop a quarterback when every snap feels like a countdown. That's where the philosophy shifted. Instead of asking which playmaker to add next, Berry started asking which problems were actually ruining Sundays, and the answer wasn't subtle. Protection wasn't just inconsistent, it was sabotaging everything else. Routes couldn't finish, reads couldn't develop, confidence couldn't build. No matter how much talent you layered on top, the results stayed the same. So Berry stopped treating the offensive line like a maintenance project and started treating it like the offense itself. This wasn't about overcorrecting or panic spending. It was about recognizing leverage. Quarterback success correlates directly with time to throw. Sack rates aren't cosmetic stats, they're survival metrics. And Berry understood that until those numbers changed, every evaluation downstream would be flawed. Wide receivers would look unreliable, quarterbacks would look overwhelmed, play calling would look conservative, all symptoms of the same disease. So the pivot became clear. Build inside out. Guards who hold, tackles who anchor, a center who actually controls protection calls. Not placeholders, not short-term fixes, real investments in stability. Barry wasn't chasing upside anymore. He was chasing dependability. Players who do their jobs so others can actually be evaluated fairly.
And once that truth set in, everything else followed. Receiver evaluations changed, contract philosophy tightened, development timelines became non-negotiable. Barry wasn't reacting to criticism, he was correcting a process, one that had allowed the Browns to confuse potential with progress for far too long. This wasn't about salvaging one season, it was about stopping a cycle. And for the first time, it felt like the front office finally knew where to apply the pressure. The Browns didn't arrive at this realization by accident. They paid for it, expensively. Betting on flash doesn't fail loudly at first. It drains you quietly, season by season, until flexibility disappears and options shrink. On paper, the decisions made sense. Big swings are how teams escape mediocrity. But in Cleveland's case, those swings came with terms that left no margin for correction once the return didn't match the investment. Jeudy became the clearest example, a premium contract tied to expectation rather than certainty. The idea was simple: pay for upside, assume refinement would follow. What the Browns learned is that upside without consistency doesn't just stagnate, it distorts everything around it. When a top-paid receiver isn't driving the offense, you don't just lose production, you lose clarity. Play calling bends, quarterbacks hesitate, coaches overcompensate, and suddenly the offense feels heavier than it should. But Jeudy's deal wasn't the only weight dragging on the system. Looming larger and far more suffocating was Deshaun Watson's contract. Fully guaranteed money changes the stakes entirely. When the return doesn't align with the cost, it doesn't just hurt the cap, it warps decision-making. It makes moving on harder, it makes patience feel forced, and it limits how aggressively you can fix the real problems elsewhere on the roster. Together, those contracts did more than disappoint. They boxed the Browns in. Resources that should have gone toward protection, depth, and development were locked into players whose impact never stabilized. That's the hidden danger of betting on flash. When it works, it accelerates everything. When it doesn't, it anchors you in place. You're stuck explaining context instead of pointing to results. You're managing consequences instead of building momentum. What finally snapped the illusion was comparison. The rookie tight end producing on a fraction of the cost. The quarterback fighting through pressure with minimal structural support. The gap between investment and impact became impossible to defend. It wasn't just that the stars underdelivered, it was that the role players outperformed them in the moments that mattered most. That's when the front office stopped framing these deals as isolated mistakes and started seeing them as symptoms of the same philosophy, paying for traits instead of outcomes, betting on reputation instead of reliability, assuming talent would smooth over instability rather than being amplified by structure. The Browns had chased fireworks and ended up with smoke. And here's the cost most teams don't admit out loud. Every year spent justifying a bad bet delays the next good one. Drafts become reactive, free agency becomes cautious, development windows close while the cap bleeds. The Browns felt that pressure tightening. And once they did, the conclusion was unavoidable. Flash isn't just expensive when it fails, it's paralyzing. By the time the calendar flips to 2026, there will be no more room for interpretation, no more developmental language, no more caveats built around circumstance. For the Cleveland Browns, that year isn't about progress, it's about judgment. Franchises don't get infinite evaluation windows, and quarterbacks certainly don't. Year 3 is where possibility turns into proof, and everyone inside the building understands what that means. For Shedeur Sanders, 2026 is the line where flashes have to become function, not hero moments, not highlight throws under duress. Consistent control of the offense, third down command, red zone efficiency. The league doesn't wait for context forever, and neither do front offices.
This is the season when teams decide if they're building forward or tearing it back down, and the Browns know they can't afford to get that decision wrong again. That's what makes every move right now feel heavier. Draft picks aren't just talent adds, they're verdict modifiers. Free agent signings aren't insurance, they're statements of belief. If the Browns truly think Sanders can be the guy, the roster around him has to reflect that conviction. Protection that holds, receivers who convert when it matters, a system that doesn't ask the quarterback to play escape artist on every snap. Without that, evaluation isn't fair, it's fiction. This is also where past mistakes tighten their grip. Contracts signed years earlier still echo into 2026. Cap space that should be flexible remains semi-frozen, and while some financial relief finally appears on the horizon, the damage has already narrowed the margin. The Browns don't get a soft landing if this plan fails. There's no graceful pivot. It's either alignment or reset. That urgency explains the shift in draft language coming out of the building. Reliability, coachability, process. These aren't buzzwords, they're filters. The Browns aren't looking for players who need the system to bend around them. They're looking for players who stabilize it, especially at wide receiver. The next WR1 isn't supposed to be a headline. He's supposed to be an answer. Someone Sanders grows with, not around. Because if 2026 ends without clarity, the consequences are brutal. Another quarterback enters limbo, another rebuild gets quietly discussed, another few years evaporate while the fan base is asked to buy into patience again. That's the real verdict looming over everything. Not just on Sanders, but on the front office itself. If this plan works, it validates the pivot. If it doesn't, it exposes the organization is still trapped in the same cycle, just dressed in smarter language. That's why 2026 isn't just a season on the schedule, it's the moment Cleveland decides who they actually are, a team that learned from its bets or one that simply shifted them. In this time, there won't be anywhere left to hide the answer. For the first time in a long time, the Cleveland Browns aren't guessing at the problem, they've named it. They've traced it back to structure, not superstition, to fit, not flash, to the quiet traits that actually hold an offense together when everything else breaks. That clarity matters because it changes how decisions get made when pressure hits. It stops excuses before they start, and it forces accountability to live in the building, not just on paper. This is why the story was never really about one receiver underperforming or one sideline exchange going public. Those were symptoms. The real shift happened when the Browns stopped confusing investment with impact, when they accepted that paying for reputation doesn't guarantee relevance, when they recognized that a rookie tight end could outproduce a marquee name, because reliability wins games even when talent stalls. Once that truth lands, you can't go back to pretending labels matter more than results. Now the responsibility moves from diagnosis to delivery. Draft picks have to hit, protection has to hold, culture has to match the talking points. Andrew Berry has drawn a clear line between what this team used to prioritize and what it can't afford to prioritize anymore. Inside-out construction. Players who stabilize, not destabilize. Roles that are earned weekly, not inherited through contracts. That doesn't guarantee success, nothing does, but it does guarantee honesty, and honesty is the one thing Cleveland hasn't always had during its rebuild cycles. The Browns finally know why things failed, they know where the weak points were, and they know what has to change if this quarterback, this roster, and this front office are going to survive the verdict waiting in 2026. Execution is the only piece left, and that's the hard part. Because clarity doesn't win games on its own, it just removes the blindfold. What happens next will decide whether this moment becomes the foundation of something real or just another chapter in a long history of almosts. The Browns have their answer key now. Whether they use it correctly is about to be revealed.